I noted in the last video how at this point you might feel slightly overwhelmed, but also to take pride in how much you've already learned. You can create basic routing, you can create views and controllers and models, you can query your database, you can configure your environment variables. So you've learned quite a bit, but of course there's still a long way to go. Before we move on to form handling and how we can accept user data through the request and persist it to the database, let's take a quick moment and review the default directory structure that comes with Laravel. If you're anything like me, you see all these folders, and if you don't know what each one does, it kind of weighs on you a bit. So let's just take a few minutes to discuss the project structure. To start, let's review some of these base files in the project root. Again, you might think, if you're not familiar with these, well, I don't know, composer.json, composer.lock, gitignore, I don't understand any of this. Well, I promise you will very soon. Okay, let's get started. Editor.config, this is a file you can delete if you want. This simply tells editors what kind of formatting you like. It's a convenience, you can delete it if you want. Next, your .environment file. You've already learned this. This is where you will store important configuration items, such as is your app running in a local environment or a production environment. All of that can be stored here. In addition, you'll store important things like your database password, or maybe your pusher keys, or your mail passwords. And again, the key is this file will never be committed to your version control. So if I take a look at gitignore, this is a file to declare all files and folders that should be ignored from Git. Now take a look right here. There's that .env file, which means you'll have one environment file for your local setup and then another one for your production setup. And this is how we can specify a local database or local search keys, maybe API keys. But then for production, you can reference different keys and codes and passwords entirely. That's an important thing to understand. You never commit this file. Git attributes, again, this is a Git-specific file for associating attributes with file types and regular expressions, as you see here. Mostly, I don't even want you to think about this. It just specifies some helpful hints to Git about how you want things to be stored. Like I said, you'll never need to reach for that most of the time. Okay, artisan. What is this? Well, when you run php artisan from the command line, you're actually triggering this file here. You'll see it pulls in an autoloader. It runs the artisan application. Again, you won't need to reach for that. Next, composer.json. You already learned about Composer. This is the configuration file that specifies all of your dependencies, maybe dependencies only for development purposes. Or in other words, it's not for production, it's only for local, like when you're testing your project. It also specifies, like we discussed, PSR for autoloading. Again, you can learn this in bits and pieces. To start at your point, you only really need to know this section and maybe a little bit of the autoloading. You can learn more as needed. Your composer.lock file is a file that takes all of the dependencies you've pulled in and it locks them to specific versions. And this ensures consistency. That way, if you share this project with somebody else, when they install their dependencies, they will get identical versions to you. So this file will be committed to your version control, or at least it should. All right, next, package.json. So this is to help with your front-end compilation. These are dependencies that will be installed through Node, and they will be referenced in your JavaScript. Going along with that is, let me skip ahead, your webpack.mix.js file. This feature here is actually one of my personal big contributions to Laravel. I built and maintain this. This is a wrapper around Webpack that makes the process of compiling your JavaScript and your Sass or your less really, really simple. So for example, maybe I don't like Sass, but I do like less. Okay, then I'll just call .less. I'll then reference a path to my less file and then specify where I want the compiled output to go. Done. I now have less support in my project. Anyways, we'll have a full lesson dedicated to that. Next, yarn. This is very similar to your composer.lock file. Again, you don't need to worry about it too much. Okay, so now you understand what all of those files refer to. Let's now refer to the directories a little bit quicker. Your vendor directory is where all Composer dependencies will be installed. So if I pull in something like PHP Unit or Carbon, those will always go to your vendor directory. You'll never edit these files, so you can ignore it. Next, any tests you write will ultimately go here. And I'll teach you quite a bit in this area towards the end of the series. Okay? Your storage directory, as you might expect, is where various storage files, log files, things like that will go. Even compiled view files will go here. Now, unless you're referring to your log files, you can probably ignore this most of the time. All right, next, your routing. You've already learned that your routes will be stored here. And as it turns out in Laravel, you can register routes in a number of ways. So these would be considered your web routes, but you can also have routes for registering artisan commands. So notice here, artisan command inspire. We'll take a look. PHP artisan inspire. And you get a little quote here. That is available because of this. So if I commented that out and ran it again, command inspire is not defined. So you could do your own here. You could say artisan command foobar, I have been triggered, and then describe replies to you when called. Okay, so let's give it a shot. PHP artisan help foobar. All right, there's our description. Here's how we trigger it. So now let's run it. PHP artisan foobar, and there is your reply. Really simple, cool stuff. And of course, you can register artisan commands in two ways. One, using this simple callback style approach, or you can have dedicated artisan classes. And again, you will reach for your make commands. So what you want right here is PHP artisan make command. Okay. Channels, this is for your broadcasting channels. This is a bit higher level. This is how your server side will communicate with your front end. So if an important event happens on the server side, well, if you need some way to communicate that to the user without requiring a page reload, you can use event broadcasting. Again, a bit higher level, so we will ignore it. And your API routes are for declaring routes specifically for your API, of course. Again, a little bit higher level, so you can ignore it for now. All right, we're making good progress. Resources are where your views and your JavaScript, your Sass, or your basic CSS, anything like that that should be compiled down, will be stored here. And you'll see Laravel includes some recommendations out of the box. I'll go over all of that with you once we get to the front-end lessons. Okay. Public, this is where compiled files will go. So any images you might have will be stored here. You just create an images directory and you're all set to go. CSS and JavaScript, those are coming from these files that are compiled down using Mix. Again, I don't want to go much further because we'll review that in its entirety. Next, your database directory stores all of the migrations you create. There's also something known as database seeding. We may review in this series or we may not, but if you do have them, they'll go here. And then also factories, and we've already learned this. This is a place to define a blueprint for what a record or a model might look like. So in this case, if you were to whip up a user, well, the user would have some kind of name, an email, a password that we can reference using secret, and a remember token. Then, within the terminal or Tinker, or even in your tests, you could do this. You could quickly whip up a user. So I could say app user class. Let's make a new user. So this will give us an instance of user with the populated fields, but it does not persist. If I want to whip up those fields and persist it, I would change that to create. And in this case, it's squawking because I think in the previous episode, we changed a few things. I think this was called username. Let's give it another shot. There we go. Yeah, we just forgot to do that in a previous episode. Okay, let's see how we're doing. So you now understand everything up until this point. Your config directory, we touched on this a bit earlier. This is where all of your various configuration settings will be stored. Settings for your app, like the name of the app, your current environment. Now, what I want you to notice, though, is we don't set these to strings. So we're not doing this. Instead, we are reaching into our environment file. And this way, in production, this value can be set to one thing, but then in your local environment, that can be set to something else. So you'll see this in most locations. The ones you'll reach for often are your database configuration, your auth configuration, and your mail configuration. And again, don't worry about these too much until you need to. Okay, your Bootstrap folder, you can mostly ignore this. This is how the framework boots itself. As you get a little more advanced, from time to time, you'll want to reach in just to figure out exactly what's happening behind the scenes. Until then, you can safely ignore it. Okay, finally, your app directory. Think of this as the place for where your app lives. All of your models will go here. All of your controllers will go here. All of your more complex artisan commands will go into the console directory. So that just leaves a few things. One, middleware. Again, this is a slightly more advanced topic. I like to think of middleware as layers of an onion. So when a request comes in, the user visits a page, it's going to go through all of these layers of the onion, like authenticate, check for maintenance mode, encrypt cookies. And it's literally a loop through all of these middleware and trigger the necessary method. Now, each layer of the onion has the opportunity to respond to the request, maybe redirect somewhere else, maybe put something in the session, maybe check some kind of authentication. Again, each of these layers of the onion has the opportunity to respond to the request in some way before it hits your controller. If we visit this kernel file, you'll see this array right here. These are middleware that are run during every single request to your application. So every time a request comes in, we're going to check all of these things. Again, a slightly higher level, so don't feel overwhelmed if you're thinking, oh, lots to learn here. You will learn it in time when needed. All right, so that just leaves the providers directory. Service providers are a very important concept in Laravel. Laravel is composed through various components that hook into one another. And in fact, you can see these if you go into the vendor directory, into Laravel, Framework, Source, Illuminate. These are all of the various components that build up and make up Laravel. Auth and mail and notifications and queuing and Redis. They're all separate components that together make up the framework. Now, those components or packages, and even ones that you build on your own, can hook themselves into Laravel through service providers. Think of these as classes that provide instructions for how to hook a component into Laravel, so to speak. Again, a little bit higher level, but if you don't believe me, let's just take a look at one. How about the Redis? All right, Redis service provider. Here's how we hook up the Redis component into Laravel. Here's how we register it, and here are the services provided. Let's do one more. How about the database layer? All right, database service provider. There's another one. Each of these components will have their own service provider. And again, if you create your own packages down the line, once you feel ready, you want to add support for something that isn't available out of the box, you'd create a package, you'd add a service provider, and you'd specify how to hook that into Laravel. When you're ready, we can talk about that. And that's it. That's all you need to know. So I know it's kind of a more boring lesson, but it's really important that we cover these basics here. Even if you don't know all the specifics, you now have a general idea of what each of these files and folders is responsible for. So in the next episode, let's move on to form handling.